Hello and welcome to the Pilgrim Way. My name is Norman Graham and I'm a minister in the Baptist Union of Churches in Scotland. The aim of these signposts is to try and help to connect the text of the Bible with our everyday lives. Welcome to our series going through the Bible from start to finish. Today I want to read a few verses from the book of Exodus chapter 3 and the first 10 verses. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I'll go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me. I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Well, today we're continuing our tour through the whole Bible by looking at key moments in the unfolding story that it tells. And I'm just going to highlight a few verses from this part of Exodus that tell us three foundational things about God crucial to the story of Israel. The God who reveals himself in the Bible is revealed to be the God who sees, the God who calls, and the God who saves. The first thing to note about Exodus is that there's roughly a 400-year gap between the events in the closing chapter of Genesis and the opening chapters of Exodus. God had predicted that Abram's descendants would be in Egypt for 400 years, where they would be oppressed by the Egyptians. Abram's children migrated to Egypt as Joseph moved the whole family there. But we learn that in Exodus 1 and verse 8 that a new Pharaoh arose who had not known Joseph, and so his people entered into a prolonged period of oppression and slavery. The second chapter closes with an ominous statement that God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. The implication is that God saw their suffering, he heard their cries, and he remembered his covenant that he made with their forefathers, and that he was about to act on their behalf in some way. For people of faith, one of the most difficult things to understand is an experience of suffering. When you're experiencing suffering, is the apparent absence of God. We wonder why he doesn't seem to hear our cries for relief, why he does nothing about our situation. It's very easy at those times to feel like God has abandoned us or to think he simply doesn't care what we're going through. And that experience is by no means unique to you or I. It's been the experience of God's people throughout the ages. And so the psalmist often cried out, How long, O Lord? Nor is there an easy answer to the apparent silence and inaction of God in our suffering. Yet we can see from the Exodus story that despite all evidence to the contrary, God does not abandon his people. The people of Israel had to endure 400 years of servitude and suffering, but God saw their plight, he heard their groaning, and none of it escaped him. We might wonder why it took God so long to do something about their situation, but that's because we view things finitely from the vantage point of our own experience, whereas God views things from his eternal perspective. The whole of history, the whole of our history is known to him, but we don't understand God's timing, plans, or purposes. In such times, we must hold firmly to the promises of God that he will never leave us or forsake us. He hadn't forgotten Israel. He wasn't deaf to their cries. He was waiting for the right moment to send a deliverer. And so God sees, he knows what's going on. The things that you are calling out to him about, he sees and he knows. And so the second thing we learn from this is that God calls. One of the great things about the story of the Exodus is that it teaches us a lot about God. In fact, it is in the story of Moses and his direct encounter with God that we first learn that God is holy. When Moses goes to investigate the burning bush, he hears God calling his name, and the very first thing God tells Moses is to stop where he is and come no closer. The reason that Moses must stop and take his sandals off is that he's standing on holy ground. Now, the ground wasn't holy in and of itself. Rather, the ground is holy because God was present there. What it's telling us is that God is holy, and wherever God is, there is holiness. And so because God was present there in the burning bush, that ground became holy ground. People tend to have a fairly negative view of holiness these days, largely because of the attitudes and behaviour of religious people over many years. If we say that a person is holier than thou, we mean that they think that they are better than everyone else. The word holy is an important word in relation to God, and so we need to understand what it means. It carries the basic meaning of separation, and so something which is holy is something which has been set apart. So we can say that the ground in the Sinai wilderness was holy because it had been set apart from the surrounding ground to receive the very presence of God. In relation to God, it means that he is set apart from everything he's made. Holiness is not simply his righteousness, although that's part of it, but also his otherness. It's the distinction between the creator and the creature, the infinite distance between God's deity and our humanity. Yet that distance between us and God is a distance which God desires to cross. So in the story of the Exodus, God is revealed to be a holy God, but one who also cares about his people and who actively seeks to be involved in their lives. The story that unfolds throughout the whole of the Bible is the story of how a holy God saved an unholy people through Jesus Christ. And the call of Moses to be that deliverer to his people. The call of Moses in the Exodus is an example that points to him being that kind of God. Although Moses is regarded as one of the greatest of the great heroes of the Bible, when you read his story, you quickly learn that not only was he totally unsuited to the job, but he was also a very reluctant hero. You get the sense right away that there was something special about Moses. I'm sure that his parents were not the only Hebrew parents in Egypt who tried to save their children from Pharaoh's order to kill them all. And yet in Exodus 2, the story of the Hebrew people is suddenly focused in and on the birth and salvation of one child, Moses. So you get the sense that right away that there is something special about him. And for Pharaoh's daughter to defy his order to have all the Hebrew children killed and take Moses out of the basket in the Nile, it's likely that she too saw something special in this baby in the basket. And so he was brought up in the palace. Maybe she considered him a gift from the gods of the Nile River. Whatever the reason, Moses was taken into the palace, and for 40 years he lived there as a prince, eating the best food, wearing the best clothes, and having the best education in the world. If the story had been written in Hollywood, it would probably stop there with the words that they all lived happily ever after. But of course, that's not how the story ends at that point. In fact, it's not even close to being the end of the story. Moses commits murder and has to flee the country. He goes out into the wilderness of Midian, where he lives for another 40 years working as a shepherd. It's a far cry from the glories of the palace. And in one day, for some unknown reason, Moses led his father-in-law's flock far into the wilderness until he came to Sinai, the mountain of God. It would be a place that will loom large in the religious and social consciousness of Israel, and one to which Moses would return many years later with the Israelites. It would be here that he would receive the 10 Commandments directly from God. There was nothing particularly important or significant about the mountain itself, except for the fact that it's described here as the mountain of God. It's described as such simply because it was here at this mountain that God descended to meet with Moses. It's most likely that prior to this encounter, Moses had very little, if any, experience of God. He probably knew about God, for his father-in-law was a priest of God, and he had no doubt taught him about how to worship. What's unknown is how much of that teaching Moses took on board and applied it to his own life, how much he really believed it. It's likely that he missed the power and privilege of life in the palace, and if he thought about God at all, he may have thought that God had abandoned him in the desert. But all of that was about to change. Moses was about to have an encounter with God that would shape his character, his worldview for the rest of his life. And beyond that, it would shape the history of the world. After this, nothing would be the same. This was Moses' defining moment. And the day probably began like any other day. Moses took the flock out looking for grazing and water, and when he was in the wilderness at Sinai, he saw a burning bush. There's nothing unusual about a burning bush in the desert. Every year in places like Australia, Canada, USA, bushfires start spontaneously as the desert heat brings dry wood to a combustible temperature. With global warming, these events are increasingly common, even on mainland Europe. So nothing particularly special about a burning bush, but it caught his attention because although it was on fire, it wasn't consumed. It just kept burning. To say the least, that was unusual because it's the nature of fire to consume what it burns. In my own life, I've been in 2 buildings that were on fire and had to escape out a window. Both fires resulted in the destruction of the things that was on fire. That's the way fire works. So the fact that this bush was burning and wasn't consumed was not only unusual, it was also unnatural. And it's no wonder it kind of caught Moses' attention. Throughout the book of Exodus, fire is a frequent sign of the presence of God. The reader is alerted to the fact that this was a supernatural event by the statement in chapter 3 verse 2 that the angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in the burning bush. Everything about this appearance was intended to teach Moses something about God. It pointed to God's eternity and self-sufficiency. Like the burning bush, God never runs out of fuel. His glory never dims. His beauty never fades. He always keeps burning bright. This is because God does not get his energy from anyone or anything outside himself. He is completely self-existent and self-sufficient in his eternal being. It also pointed to God's power over creation and what perhaps was intended to give Moses a clue to what would follow. For as Peter Enns notes, although bushes do not remain unscorched when on fire, neither do rivers turn to blood. Frogs, flies and locusts do not normally invade a nation. Gnats are not formed from the dust. Hail and darkness do not fall on command. The firstborn of a nation do not all die in one night. Seas do not form walls of water. Moses would have been wise to learn a lesson from this burning bush. The God who is calling him is the God over creation. The natural phenomenon do his bidding. All are under his control. In light of this, the excuses that Moses goes on to make in this passage to try and avoid God's call in his life are laughably ridiculous. The call of Moses teaches us a really important lesson about Christian ministry, namely that all Christian ministry begins with the call of God. Notice that from the outset, it was God who took the initiative in this encounter. Moses wasn't looking for an encounter with God. He wasn't looking to meet with God. He was looking for grazing. But God was looking to meet with him. So it was God who appeared in the burning bush and attracted his attention. The call to ministry, whatever that ministry may be, begins with the call of God and not our own desires. It's not enough that we may desire to have a particular ministry as a pastor or as a leader in a church organisation or whatever. There must also be an accompanying sense of a call from God to that ministry. And we should be careful to note that God often shapes our desires and passions in order to direct us into a particular ministry. If you can't stand children, then God's probably not calling you to children's ministry. Moses' character was that of a deliverer. He was offended by injustice. He had care and compassion for the oppressed. And in fact, that was why he committed murder in the first place, defending his countrymen, his fellow Israelites. However, his true ministry as a deliverer didn't really begin until God called him to that ministry. Whenever the Apostle Paul speaks about his authority or his mission or his ministry, he always speaks of the call that God placed on his life to serve him. In fact, if you read through the entire Bible, you'll not find a single person who exercised a God-glorifying ministry who was not firstly called by God to that work. God heard and saw the suffering of his people, and his plan was to deliver them and bring them out into a land they could call their own. And his plan was to fulfill the promises he made to Abraham and save his people. And so when he saw what their oppression, he called a deliverer. And the purpose of that was because God is the God who saves. If there's one simple message we are meant to take from the story of the Exodus, it is this: that the God of the Bible is a God who saves. But it's not simply what he does, it's who he is. God heard and saw and felt the plight of humanity, bound and trapped and condemned by sin, and his response was to enter into our humanity with all its suffering and sorrow in order to redeem us from it. John tells us that in his gospel that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, God enfleshed. He fully entered into our humanity. And apart from the grace and mercy of God in Jesus, there's no salvation. The Bible is clear on this. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that whoever believes in him won't perish but have eternal life. Just as Moses was called and sent to deliver his people out of bondage in Israel, that's meant to signpost us towards the New Testament and the story that it tells. It's meant to signpost us towards the Gospels, to signpost us towards the fact that Jesus, God in the flesh, came and dwelt among us and gave himself for us to save us from our sins and their dreadful consequences. Because the God of the Bible is the God who saves. It's not just what he does, it's who he is. And he does not turn away those who come to him looking for salvation. No matter what it is you think you've done, no matter how far you think you've fallen, God is the God who saves. And he is willing and able to save you and me. Thanks for listening.